Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back to the PrimateCast. I'm your host, Andrew McIntosh, and the release date for today's podcast is Tuesday, September the 19th, 2017. Now, for the 56th rendition of the PrimateCast, I sat down with Dr. Chris Whittier to talk about wildlife vets and conservation medicine.
It's funny because I think a lot of people perceive that, veterinarians, that we're eager to get in there and we want to be manipulating things, and, any chance that we have to be, darting and anesthetizing animals, we want to be doing. And I think that there is, I think that's one of the challenges of trying to be a wildlife veterinarian, particularly with great apes, is it's much harder. Very often the hard decision to make, which is usually the right decision, is not to do something.
So Chris Whittier is a wildlife health professional based at the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine at Tufts University. He also has ties to the Department of Infectious Disease and Global Health, and he directs the master's program in conservation medicine at the Tufts Center for Conservation Medicine. Now, I first met Chris when we bunked together at a workshop on great ape conservation, infectious disease, and parasitism run by some mutual colleagues of ours in the Czech Republic in 2013. And it was at that time that I really got interested in what Chris is doing, particularly as it relates to things like applied wildlife veterinary medicine, which might involve things like wildlife health interventions, which might include vaccinations, for example, or targeting animals that need treatment following succumbing to some kind of infectious disease. And so we talk about that and some of the challenges and ethics involved in those issues. And I think Chris got started in all that as a veterinarian with the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project, which was a brainchild of Diane Fossey. And now it's commonly known as Gorilla Doctors, and you can find that online for more information at gorilladoctors.org, which is in collaboration with the University of California at Davis. So like the last episode of the PrimateCast, this interview with Dr. Chris Whittier was also taken at last year's Congress of the International Primatological Society, held in Chicago in August. And Chris was in town joining a symposium, presenting in a symposium on great ape health monitoring in Africa. And I took the opportunity to sit down with him, reconnect, and talk about this stuff, conservation medicine, extreme conservation. And I hope everyone enjoys this interview on the PrimateCast with Dr. Chris Whittier.
Maybe just to start out, can you tell us about how your involvement in the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project and maybe how that kind of thing came to fruition?
Yeah, sure. So I was one of the regional field veterinarians for the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project from 2001 through 2006. And the origin of the project actually started, Diane Fossey, when she was still alive, appreciated that the gorillas were having various health concerns, the biggest one of which was occasionally getting accidentally caught in snares. Mm-hmm. And so the gorillas are, those snares are set for other animals, but they're pretty indiscriminate and they're pretty well hidden, and every once in a while the gorillas accidentally get caught in them. Mm-hmm. Gorillas are strong enough that when they get caught they can break it away from whatever it's attached to, but then they're stuck with that wire or that rope stuck around their hand or their foot, and they can become infected, or they can lose their hand or their foot. And so those need to be taken off to try to save their lives. So Fossey requested veterinary assistance kind of specifically, for that type of work. Mm-hmm. And actually those discussions started just before she died, although the project didn't get off the ground until just after she died. And so that's, the project started with the veterinarian on there, primarily to be able to respond to snares, and then it just sort of grew from there.
So I think in your talk you presented data that show, now the mountain gorilla population there in Volcanoes National Park is on the rise, is looking quite healthy at the moment. Yep. And so part of that is because of the massive conservation effort, but then part of it, according to your talk and what people see, is directly related to this project. Yeah.
So there's a publication from, I think Martha Robbins is the lead author, and the title is about sort of this idea of extreme conservation. Mm-hmm. And the mountain gorillas are a relatively unique situation because of the economics, because of where they are geographically, the fact that you can get tourists in and out of there pretty easily. There's infrastructure, there's a tourist history, and a lot of stakeholders that are interested and invested. Mostly because of Diane Fossey and her legacies with sort of all these organizations. And so one of the things that Martha was interested in looking at is how all those things together contribute to the successful conservation of the mountain gorillas. And they had a nice enough data set that they're actually able to look at groups where there had been veterinary care. And even though it's the sort of the same population, there were years that the vets couldn't go into Congo.
Right.
And so they had a good sample of data of essentially gorillas that were having some of the benefits of being monitored and some of the anti-poaching, but not having veterinary access or having veterinarians have access to them. And so they're able to kind of tease out that bit of a difference. And you can attribute the veterinary care to about half of the growth. So the population growth is like 4%, 2% of which can be attributed to the veterinary care. And so I actually had a good talk with Martha about this yesterday, and I think one of the important take-home messages there is that the veterinary care has certainly been contributing, but it should always be kept in mind that it's contributing, and it's part of a pretty complex effort that involves a lot of other pieces with just the other conservation methods and the rangers and the investment from all the parks and things like that.
Yeah. So I imagine, you mentioned extreme conservation, so in many ways it is quite extreme. Like in the best case scenario, you probably wouldn't need this kind of effort if you had healthy populations, but just because of the drastically small numbers we're dealing with, it seems to be more and more necessary.
Yeah, and I feel like just even in the sort of length of my career, not that I'm that old or that young, but when I was in vet school, I think there was still the sort of paradigm was these are wild animals, they should be left alone, and I think that's slowly shifted to the realization that, yes, these are wild animals, but we're doing a lot to interfere with their lives. Starting by being there in the first place, whether it's for research or for tourism or for anything else. And I think that the sort of follow-up of that is then, if we're interfering with them, then don't we owe them some sort of a trade-off? Like, shouldn't we be doing things to protect them? And does that protection extend to doing veterinary care if and when it might be needed? I think that my philosophy is that none of these animals are really that wild anymore. Not the ones that anybody's studying to any extent, because the fact that anybody's there and that we can get that close means that we've already affected their behavior. In addition to the fact that these are also, there's inherent value in these animals, and being able to keep them alive just like we do with our fellow humans and domestic animals and things like that. There's a reason that we have healthcare. There's a reason that we have veterinary care, and so I think that you can also think of it as just another way of trying to protect them, just like keeping the forest from being cut down, making sure that they're not being hunted, also giving them access to healthcare. So I think all of those things kind of fold together and sort of can be thought of as contributing to that.
So some of the more recent kinds of interventions that we've seen include vaccinations for certain things, and I know you've been involved in that. So you can just run us through some of the projects.
So the idea of vaccinating into the habituated ape populations it's not really a new idea. So there are precedents. The chimps at Gombe were vaccinated against polio, and I guess it was the early 80s. I've forgotten the exact date. During what appeared to be a local human outbreak, and some of the chimps suffered. There's actually still, just because it was before we were really doing good diagnostics and doing good sample collection, there's still a question as to whether or not that was really polio. But nonetheless, it did seem to prevent the outbreak from spreading and animals from dying. Likewise, the same thing happened with the measles epidemic, with the mountain gorillas. In the late 80s, and there have been vaccination efforts with the chimpanzees in Thai as well for various things. And all of those cases were really sort of reactive. Animals were dying, and there was a chance to go in and sort of snuff out outbreaks and make sure that they didn't spread and that more animals didn't die. So with that sort of precedent in mind, there started to be discussion in the past few years about, one of the bad things on the horizon, or that we know has affected apes very badly, is Ebola. And in this day, I was going to say in this day and age, but we currently have a number of pretty good vaccines that have been developed, for human use that have various stages of testing and things like that. And so there started to be the question of, if we have vaccines and that could prevent Ebola, and we're worried about Ebola as like an existential threat to, gorillas in particular, then does it make any sense to think about vaccinating them?
Yeah.
And so it's that's the sort of simple version, and as I discussed yesterday, it gets pretty complicated when you think about the fact that there might be somewhere in the order of 150,000 Western lowland gorillas. Of all of those, there might be 100 that are habituated, that could be darted, and that you could think about giving one of those existing vaccines to, and then what are you going to do with the other 99% of them that you can't get anywhere near? So, but just to start to figure out the sort of practicality of, could we dart the ones that you can get close to? And this hadn't been done yet with Western lowland gorillas until 2011. And of course, I always point out that obviously the reason that we have Western lowland gorillas in zoos is because people went out and darted them, when they're totally wild. And so, it's not that there's any sort of groundbreaking in being able to go out and sort of dart and get that close to gorillas and get them darted, but there hadn't been unlike the very long and successful history of veterinary care with the mountain gorillas, going back to '86 and the Virungas. There hadn't been any history like that with the Western lowland gorillas, in large part because there weren't very many that were habituated, and those that were in pretty remote areas. And it's hard to justify thinking about having a full-time veterinary presence if you've only got a handful of gorillas and there aren't sort of common problems. So when the initial thought about can we even go and dart gorillas that might be habituated, the challenges were. There was some concern about the possibility that gorillas might simply run away. Yeah. And, I guess there's a precedent for that with gorillas that had been, pretty well habituated and just decided to move their range for whatever reason. And, the Western lowland gorillas move around a lot more than mountain gorillas, so that was part of the worry. But the bigger worry is that the, Western lowland gorillas have been hunted throughout human history. And, so there was a feeling that they're probably going to be much more defensive. And that if we go out and, start shooting darts at them and pointing things at them, that somebody was going to get really badly hurt. And we agreed that there's certainly a risk of those things, but there's sort of only one way to find out, and that if we did things properly and used the experience and the skills that we've developed with mountain gorillas, that we could at least explore the possibility of doing that. So. That's essentially exactly what we did with many, many contingency plans and lots of negotiations. But in 2011, we went in to just sort of see if we could get them darted, if we could keep a vaccine cold in the field, how are they going to react. And so it was a very, very elaborate project with a lot of planning. And actually, I always like to applaud the World Wildlife Fund for being sort of bold enough to kind of push the envelope on this with trying to do this. But we weren't about to use an experimental Ebola vaccine, so we used a measles vaccine, and the gorillas they're at risk of measles, which is still a serious problem in many parts of Africa, and we know the vaccine is safe, and all gorillas in zoos everywhere are given measles vaccine. And for people that don't know, measles is actually a human disease, and so the only risk of getting it is really from people. So that's one of the vaccines that I think you can make a pretty good argument that we should be giving. The reason that we give it to gorillas is to protect them from people and gorillas in zoos, and so it's not a whole lot different than gorillas that are in the wild that are being approached by people on a pretty regular basis. So we did that in 2011, and had very, very little reactions from the gorillas. I mean, they're mostly a little bit surprised. Nobody likes to get jabbed if they when they don't need to be. But there was no aggression. I don't think there were even any vocalizations. Occasional they might dash a couple yards in surprise, but we were very pleasantly surprised how well it went over. And I think again with the very well trained team of people that are working for World Wildlife Fund in the field, the experience that I had from working with mountain gorillas, and just sort of a lot of preparation and caution that we were able to do that. Yeah.
So at this IPS 2016, there was a nice session we had on health monitoring disease, and it was mostly restricted to the great apes and the stuff that you're involved with in Africa. But just from your perspective, I mean, how has this kind of field grown, and where do you see both yourself and just the continuation of this kind of work going?
Well, I think I guess the first thing I would say is I think people have asked oftentimes about how are the mountain gorillas going to do? What's their sort of future? And and I've always said that there are certain political things that you might not be able to predict, but the population is growing, and there's good vet care, and there's a lot of investment in that project and that work, and I think on those counts they're going to do fine. but they're in a very unique situation with a whole bunch of different parameters, including the full-time vet care, that makes it a pretty unique situation. Yeah. And when I left the project, my hope was that I could sort of use some of the skills and training and experience that I got from doing that to apply those skills in other places, to try to help other populations. And since that time, there's close to a full-time vet presence at Thai. Mm-hmm. There's a pretty good vet presence at Gombe, and increasingly more with in-country, the resident, locals that have been trained as veterinarians and get a little bit of additional training just because they generally don't get a lot of wildlife. So I think that's slowly happening, and it's been nice to be able to sort of be a part of kind of helping to spread some of that to other areas where it's needed. So I think that's the first thing, is that just there is that kind of applied veterinary care that is happening in more and more places. Organizations are finding justification for it, finding the funding, and that the capacity is being built. In some areas, still lacking obviously in a lot of other areas, but it is happening. And the other thing is that I think that by and large the kind of the quality of medicine is improving. I mean, even in the time we were with the mountain gorillas, we like to think that we improved the anesthetic protocol. We started using inhalation, basically using gas anesthesia in the field rather than just injectable drugs, which gives you a lot more control over the situation. And so. I think a lot of things like that have been, are advancing. Likewise, as I presented, we can also start looking at things like, when the rare occasions that we deem it necessary to do things like give antibiotics for different kinds of infections, we can now start monitoring, is that having any kind of a negative, trade-off? Yes, it might be preventing them from, getting a fulminant pneumonia that's going to kill them, but is it messing up the bacteria in their intestines and causing diarrhea or doing other things? And, now with the sort of advances in technology, we're able to do a lot of that and answer a lot of those questions. Yeah. And so that's really nice, and it's really gratifying because, it's funny because I think a lot of people perceive that, veterinarians, that we're eager to get in there and we want to be manipulating things, and, any chance that we have to be, darting and anesthetizing animals, we want to be doing. And I think that there is, I think that's one of the challenges of trying to be a wildlife veterinarian, particularly with great apes, is it's much harder. Very often the hard decision to make, which is usually the right decision, is not to do something. Yeah. And so that, and I think that's where, by and large, our profession probably needs to keep working. And there's a certain importance and sort of necessary skill and experience needed to be able to, either reassure authorities that, in most cases these animals are probably going to be fine, or start to question, if a couple of gorillas have a fight and one of them suffers mortal wounds, should he be left to die? Right. And that's the sort of natural progression. And the philosophy of the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project has always been, to only intervene if something is clearly caused by people or if it's life-threatening. Right. And you get into a little bit of a gray area with things being life-threatening because, it doesn't, you can die from pretty simple infections if you really want to. But I think there's also, relatively clear things like, fighting male gorillas that's part of their life. Yeah. And if you're intervening and saving too many of those male gorillas, then the adult males in the population gets out of whack and you start to have, real problems. So I think that, there's there always has to be an understanding, and it's best if this is all kind of agreed and negotiated beforehand as to what is going to be appropriate decision tree for how and when you might step in as a veterinarian, under what circumstances, and making sure that all the stakeholders are in agreement about that. Okay, cool. Well, thanks so much, Chris Whittier, for joining us on the PrimateCast, and look forward to see you at the next one. Yeah, thanks. It was enjoyable.
You have been listening to the PrimateCast, a podcast series dedicated to the study and conservation of primates around the world. Brought to you by the Centre for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology of the Primate Research Institute of Kyoto University. Visit us online at www.cisasp.pi.kyoto-u.ac.jp/news/podcasts and follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/theprimatecast and on Twitter at theprimatecast.